The Italian front during World War I was a place of brutal struggle, where soldiers fought not only against enemy forces, but also against the unforgiving elements of nature. One of the most dangerous and unexpected enemies in the Alps was the snow. In the winter of 1916, the snowstorms in the Dolomite Mountains created deadly conditions for the soldiers stationed there. As the cold winter deepened, the snow began to pile up at alarming rates. By the beginning of December, snowdrifts in the region reached up to 10 feet, blocking roads, cutting off supply lines, and making movement nearly impossible. The Italian and Austro-Hungarian armies were both entrenched in these mountains, locked in a desperate struggle, where both sides faced not only gunfire but also the crushing weight of the snow and ice. The men in these remote mountain positions were ill-equipped to handle such extreme cold. Most soldiers wore clothing that offered little protection against frostbite and hypothermia, leaving them vulnerable to the bitter chill that could freeze their bodies in an instant. It wasn't just the soldiers who suffered. Civilians living in the foothills of the mountains were equally at risk. Whole villages were isolated, cut off by snow-blocked roads with no access to medical care or food supplies. The conditions were so harsh that soldiers sometimes froze to death in their foxholes, unable to protect themselves from the cold. Others were left stranded for days without proper supplies, as heavy snowfalls blocked any attempts to bring in more resources. The isolation was not just physical, but psychological as well. These men were stuck in an environment that seemed to work against them at every turn. Every moment of every day felt like a struggle for survival. In the middle of these harsh conditions, a deadly force was quietly building up in the snow-packed mountains. The Dolomites, with their steep slopes and unpredictable weather, were a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The snow had been accumulating for weeks, and with each new storm, the snowpacks became more unstable. With temperatures fluctuating wildly between freezing cold and brief thaws, the conditions were perfect for an avalanche. Avalanches were nothing new in the mountains, but no one could have anticipated the scale of destruction that would be unleashed on December 13th of 1916. It's not entirely clear why or how the avalanches happened that day, but many factors contributed. Some reports suggest that the snowpacks had been weakened by shelling. Both sides were so desperate to bury their enemies that they may have fired shells at the snow in an attempt to trigger an avalanche, though no one can say for certain how much this contributed to the event. What is known is that the avalanches came suddenly, without warning, and with terrifying force. The day of the avalanches has since been remembered as White Friday, despite the fact that it took place on a Wednesday. The term was coined because the disaster was so horrific that it became a day marked in history. For those who lived through it, however, the memory of that day was forever tied to chaos, fear, and unimaginable loss. As we will see, the scale of destruction that followed was unlike anything the soldiers had prepared for, but the full extent of the tragedy would not become clear until much later. The soldiers and civilians trapped in the avalanche's path were left to deal with the aftermath in ways that few had ever experienced before. As the morning of December 13th, 1916 dawned over the Dolomites, no one could have predicted the disaster that was about to strike. The soldiers stationed in the mountain barracks had grown used to the harsh conditions, but even they couldn't have been prepared for what nature was about to unleash. The Austro-Hungarian barracks on Mount Marmolada, one of the most significant targets during the conflict, sat at nearly 11,000 feet above sea level. Built in the summer of 1916, the barracks had been strategically placed atop the Grand Pose summit, out of reach from high-angle mortar fire and in a location that seemed secure from attack. But despite the location's strategic advantages, the barracks were vulnerable to something far more deadly than the enemy artillery: avalanches. The snow, which had been accumulating for weeks, had reached dangerous depths. In the days leading up to the avalanche, the weather had been erratic. The sudden thaw that had followed a period of heavy snowfall only weakened the snowpacks further, making them ripe for disaster. While the soldiers were preoccupied with the ongoing war and the cold, they weren't aware that the snow was on the verge of collapse. The Austro-Hungarian commander, Captain Rudolf Schmid, recognized the growing danger. He feared the snow was becoming unstable and that his position would soon become untenable. On December 9th, Captain Schmid sent a request to his superior, Field Marshal Lieutenant Ludwig Geuginger, asking to vacate the barracks before disaster struck. However, his request was denied and his unit was left in place. It wasn't just the soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian barracks who were at risk. The Italian divisions positioned in the mountains were equally vulnerable. While the Austro-Hungarians had made some attempts to prepare for the worst, the Italians had no such plans in place. Their soldiers were spread out along the peaks and valleys, unaware that the snow in the higher altitudes was becoming a ticking time bomb. As the day wore on, the conditions in the mountains only worsened. Heavy snow continued to fall, and by the time the sun began to set, the unstable snowpack on Mount Marmolada was on the verge of collapse. The soldiers, who had been working in freezing temperatures for days on end, now faced the full force of nature's wrath. What they didn't know was that the avalanche was only moments away. When the avalanche finally hit, it came down with an overwhelming force. It swept across the mountainside, overwhelming everything in its path. The snow came crashing down so violently that it seemed like the entire mountain was shaking. The barracks on Mount Marmolada were directly in the path of the avalanche, and within moments, the entire structure was buried beneath tons of snow. The force of the avalanche was so strong that it not only buried the barracks, but also destroyed everything around it. The soldiers who had been stationed there had no chance to escape. The avalanche didn't stop there. In fact, it was just the first of several that would strike on that fateful day. The snow continued to fall, and avalanches triggered by the unstable snowpack would hit other areas, including Italian positions and other Austro-Hungarian sites. The destruction was catastrophic, with hundreds of men buried alive beneath the snow. The impact was immediate and devastating. The soldiers, caught off guard by the avalanche's power, struggled to dig their comrades out from beneath the snow, but time was against them. The snow was too deep and the wreckage too vast. By the end of the day, the full scale of the tragedy had begun to reveal itself. Hundreds of soldiers had been killed or trapped, and the avalanche's impact had spread far beyond Mount Marmolada. The snow, which had once seemed like a silent enemy, had become a violent and unrelenting force, taking the lives of thousands. The death toll was not fully realized in the immediate aftermath, but estimates suggest that the total number of casualties, including those who died in subsequent avalanches, may have been in the thousands. For those who survived, the sense of chaos and terror was overwhelming. They were left to dig through the snow, searching for any sign of life among the wreckage. As the survivors tried to recover from the disaster, the snowstorms continued, making any rescue efforts almost impossible. And while the snow continued to fall, the true scale of the disaster began to sink in. The avalanche that had struck on December 13th was one of the worst in history, marking a devastating chapter in the story of the Italian front during World War I. But for those trapped in the mountains, the battle for survival had just begun. The aftermath of the White Friday Avalanches was nothing short of horrific. As December 13th, 1916 drew to a close, the full extent of the devastation slowly began to emerge. What had started as an ordinary winter's day on the Italian front quickly escalated into one of the deadliest natural disasters in history. In the wake of the avalanches, the landscape had been completely transformed. The once pristine mountains of the Dolomites were now a chaotic, treacherous sight. The snow had buried everything in its path, buildings, equipment, and men, leaving the soldiers and civilians trapped under tons of snow and debris. Entire units had been wiped out, and those who survived found themselves in an unimaginable situation. The search for survivors was a desperate and grueling task. Rescue operations were nearly impossible in the immediate aftermath. The snow was too deep, the conditions too dangerous, and the cold too intense. Those who survived the initial wave of avalanches were left to dig through the snow, searching for any signs of life among the wreckage. But with no tools and limited resources, the chances of finding anyone alive seemed slim. The soldiers who had been stationed at the barracks on Mount Marmolada had no time to prepare. They were buried under snow so quickly that many didn't even have the chance to flee. Even for those who managed to survive the initial avalanche, the struggle for life had only just begun. The freezing temperatures and lack of supplies made survival increasingly difficult as the hours passed. Hypothermia set in quickly, and many soldiers, trapped under the snow, slowly succumbed to the cold. It wasn't just the soldiers in the immediate vicinity of Mount Marmolada who were affected. Other Italian and Austro-Hungarian positions further down the front were also struck by avalanches on the same day. As the snow swept down the mountainsides, entire companies were swept away. The devastation was widespread, affecting both sides of the conflict. The chaos was compounded by the heavy snowfall and the ongoing risk of additional avalanches. No one was safe from nature's fury. The terror didn't end with the initial avalanche. After the first wave hit, additional avalanches continued to fall throughout the region, catching more men off guard. While some soldiers were able to escape the worst of the disaster, many found themselves trapped under piles of snow struggling to breathe and find their bearings. They faced the relentless onslaught of snow and ice, each moment feeling like a battle for survival. The snowstorms that had caused the avalanches showed no signs of letting up, and the constant threat of more avalanches loomed over the soldiers. Visibility was reduced to nearly nothing, and in the thick, heavy snow, any attempt at a coordinated rescue was futile. The soldiers who had been caught in the disaster were left to rely on their instincts, digging through the snow with bare hands, hoping to find any sign of life. In addition to the avalanche's physical toll, the emotional strain on the soldiers was immense. They were not only fighting against the elements, but also dealing with the shock of losing comrades. The cries for help could be heard in the distance, but with no way to reach the trapped soldiers in time, the helplessness was overwhelming. For many, the scene was one of total chaos. Soldiers frantically searching for survivors, while others succumbed to the cold and the weight of the snow. The total number of casualties was impossible to determine in the immediate aftermath, as so many soldiers were still missing or buried under the snow. Estimates later placed the death toll at over 2,000 soldiers, with some accounts suggesting that the number could be much higher. Civilian casualties, though fewer, also added to the tragedy as the avalanches devastated nearby towns and villages. It wasn't just the soldiers who paid the price for nature's fury. The surrounding civilian population also suffered, trapped by the same snowstorm that claimed the soldiers' lives. In the days following the avalanche, the full scale of the disaster continued to unfold. With no clear way to communicate and supplies running low, it became evident that this wasn't just an isolated tragedy. It was a turning point in the war itself. The avalanche had wiped out significant portions of the Austro-Hungarian and Italian forces, forcing both sides to regroup and rethink their strategies. While the avalanches may have been caused by natural forces, the devastation they caused was made worse by the circumstances of the war. The soldiers, already weakened by months of fighting in the harsh winter conditions, were now facing an even more insidious enemy, nature itself. The avalanche, like the war, showed no mercy, and its consequences would ripple through the lives of all who were affected for years to come. The White Friday Avalanches were a stark reminder of the unpredictability of nature and the power it holds over the course of human history. While the soldiers on the front lines fought bravely against the enemy, they could not have predicted that nature itself would be their greatest adversary. For those who lived through the avalanche, the memories of that terrible day would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And for the families of the soldiers who perished, the pain of loss would linger, never truly fading. The consequences of the White Friday avalanches weren't just felt in the immediate aftermath, but stretched on for weeks, months, and even years. The scale of the disaster left deep scars, both physical and emotional, on the soldiers, civilians, and the wider region. The destruction of entire military units and the loss of so many lives served as a grim reminder of how nature can reshape the course of history, especially in the midst of war. In the aftermath of December 13, 1916, both the Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces had to reevaluate their positions. Entire divisions had been wiped out in the avalanches, and the war effort was severely impacted. The men who survived found themselves not only grappling with the loss of comrades, but also trying to make sense of how such a catastrophe could occur. The snow, which had been a silent and ever-present force in the mountains, had suddenly become a terrifying enemy. The surviving soldiers were forced to deal with the physical toll of the avalanche. Many had been trapped under tons of snow for hours, some even longer, before they were rescued. They were frostbitten, exhausted, and traumatized, often suffering from injuries sustained during the avalanche. The freezing temperatures and lack of proper medical supplies made their recovery slow and painful. Even those who had escaped the avalanche with relatively minor injuries were left mentally scarred, haunted by the memories of that day. The emotional trauma was equally devastating. Those who had survived found themselves surrounded by the wreckage of their former comrades and struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the loss. Many soldiers had spent months on the front lines, enduring grueling conditions, but nothing could have prepared them for the horrors of the avalanche. The cries for help, the sight of men being buried alive in snow, and the chaos of trying to rescue the trapped, all of these elements would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. On the civilian side, the situation was just as dire. Entire villages and towns had been cut off by the snow, and many residents found themselves without basic necessities. The avalanches not only disrupted military operations, but also led to a breakdown in the local infrastructure. Roads were blocked and communication lines were severed. The civilians who lived in the areas surrounding the Dolomites were left to fend for themselves, facing the same brutal conditions as the soldiers. As the recovery effort began, it became clear just how massive the damage was. The avalanche had affected both sides of the conflict, with the total number of casualties reaching into the thousands. But the true scale of the destruction was not immediately apparent. In many areas, rescue teams struggled to reach the buried soldiers and civilians. The snow was simply too deep, and the risk of further avalanches kept many teams from venturing into the worst-hit areas. Those who were trapped under the snow had little hope of survival without immediate help. Over time, some of the survivors were able to make their way out of the disaster zones, though they were often in poor condition. As news of the avalanche spread, the rest of the world began to learn of the tragedy. The incident became known as the White Friday Avalanches, and it was soon clear that it was one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern history. While the conflict of World War I continued to rage, the memory of the avalanches remained an ever-present shadow, reminding those who survived just how fragile life can be in the face of nature's fury. In the years that followed, the effects of the disaster would continue to reverberate. The loss of so many soldiers impacted both the Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces in ways that were hard to quantify. Many of the men who survived the avalanches were physically and mentally broken, and they struggled to continue their military duties. Some would later be sent to different fronts or even return home, unable to carry on in the same capacity. The avalanches of December 13, 1916, didn't just change the lives of those directly affected. They were a stark reminder to future generations about the power of nature and the unpredictable ways it can alter the course of human history. As the survivors moved on with their lives, many chose to honor the memory of their fallen comrades, and the event itself would be remembered annually, marked by a somber observance on St. Lucy's Day. Yet for those who had been caught in the path of the avalanche, it remained a haunting memory of nature's merciless hand in a time of war. As we reflect on the events of White Friday, it's essential to remember that the disaster wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a turning point in the way both soldiers and civilians interacted with the harsh Alpine landscape. It serves as a reminder that nature can be as unpredictable and devastating as any enemy army, and that the forces of the natural world must never be underestimated. The White Friday Avalanches of December 13, 1916, remain one of the most devastating natural disasters to ever strike during a time of war. The tragic events not only left a lasting mark on the soldiers and civilians caught in their path, but they also changed the way avalanches were understood and handled in the future. What began as a bitter winter turned into one of the deadliest days in the history of avalanches, and the impact would be felt long after the snow had settled. In the aftermath, the full scale of the disaster gradually came into focus. The death toll was staggering, with thousands of soldiers and civilians lost in the snow. The grief was immeasurable, as entire units and villages were wiped out in a matter of hours. But alongside the devastation, there were also stories of incredible survival. Those who had managed to escape the avalanches found themselves dealing with injuries, trauma, and the overwhelming sense of loss. For many, the memory of that day would never leave them, serving as a constant reminder of how quickly life can change when nature unleashes its fury. In the years following the disaster, the White Friday Avalanches would be remembered not only as a military tragedy, but also as a cautionary tale about the unpredictable power of the natural world. For those who lived through it, the memory of the avalanche's terrifying roar and the deafening silence that followed was something they could never forget. The soldiers who survived would carry the scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives, and their stories became an integral part of the history of World War I. Efforts to rebuild after the disaster were slow and difficult. In many areas, the damage to infrastructure was so severe that it took years for normal life to resume. But even as the physical landscape was repaired, the emotional toll on the survivors and the families of the fallen would never fully heal. In time, the event would be commemorated every year on St. Lucy's Day, not just as a way of remembering the loss of life, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of such unimaginable devastation. The White Friday Avalanches of 1916 may have been a tragedy, but they also served as a reminder of the unpredictable and often uncontrollable forces of nature. They taught us that no matter how advanced our technology or how strong our will, we are still at the mercy of the natural world. And in this case, The avalanche reminded everyone involved in that brutal war that no matter how hard the human spirit fights, nature itself can be the ultimate victor. As we reflect on this terrible moment in history, it's crucial to honor the memory of those who perished in the snow, whether they were soldiers, civilians, or anyone caught in the avalanche's path. Their sacrifices, both on the battlefield and in the face of nature's wrath, should never be forgotten. And as we continue to study the lessons of the White Friday Avalanches, we are reminded once again that nature, in all its beauty and danger, remains one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the past as we uncovered the chilling history of the White Friday Avalanches. If you have any thoughts or reflections on this story, feel free to share them in the comments, and be sure to check out more historical stories as we continue to explore the moments that shaped our world. In the early morning hours of April 29, 1903, a disaster struck the small mining town of Frank, in what was then the District of Alberta in the Northwest Territories. It happened so suddenly, so violently, that within seconds, an entire mountain side came crashing down, burying everything in its path. This catastrophic event, known as the Rockslide, remains one of Canada's deadliest landslides, and a chilling reminder of nature's raw and unpredictable power. Frank was a young town, established just 2 years before, in 1901, when rich coal seams were discovered at the base of Turtle Mountain. It was named after Henry Frank, one of the owners of the Canadian-American Coal and Coke Company, which operated the mine that fueled the town's economy. The settlement quickly grew, attracting miners and their families, as well as businesses looking to capitalize on the booming industry. By April of 1903, Frank had a population of about 600 people. It had 4 hotels, a 2-story school, and a bustling main street. However, there were signs that all was not well with Turtle Mountain. The Blackfoot and Tunaxa indigenous peoples had long referred to it as the mountain that moves, warning that the land was unstable. Scientists today know that the mountain was made up of layers of hard limestone sitting on top of much softer rock. Over time, water had seeped into cracks in the rock, eroding it from the inside. This natural instability was made worse by the coal mining operations that had been carving tunnels deep into the mountain. As miners dug out coal, they unknowingly weakened the mountain's structure even further. In the months leading up to the slide, miners noticed troubling signs. Small tremors shook the tunnels, coal broke loose from its seams unexpectedly, and pressure seemed to be building inside the mountain. Some workers even described hearing deep, unsettling rumblings from within Turtle Mountain, like the growl of something massive and restless. But despite these warning signs, the town carried on with business as usual. Then on that fateful night, disaster struck. A sudden cold snap followed an unusually wet winter, likely worsening the already fragile conditions within Turtle Mountain. At exactly 4:10 in the morning, a deafening roar shattered the silence. A massive section of the mountain, measuring over 1,000 meters wide and more than 400 meters high, suddenly gave way. In mere seconds, an astonishing 82 million tons of limestone rock came crashing down the valley, moving at over 100 kilometers per hour. The rockslide was so powerful that it shot across the valley floor and even climbed up the opposite hillside before finally coming to rest. The force of the slide obliterated everything in its path. A 2-kilometer stretch of the Canadian Pacific Railway was completely buried. The coal mine's buildings vanished beneath a sea of stone. Homes and businesses on the eastern edge of Frank were instantly crushed. Some residents were likely still asleep when the avalanche of rock swallowed them whole. The sound of the disaster was heard as far away as Cochrane, over 200 kilometers to the north. As the dust settled, the true horror of what had happened began to emerge. Dozens of families had been buried alive. The once thriving town was now a broken landscape of shattered buildings and lifeless stone. The people of Frank had just experienced one of the most devastating natural disasters in Canadian history, and in the coming hours, they would have to face an unimaginable reality, one that would change their town forever. But in the midst of the destruction, a few remarkable survival stories would soon emerge. The days leading up to the Rockslide were filled with subtle warnings, signs that, in hindsight, painted a clear picture of the disaster that was about to unfold. However, at the time, these signals were either ignored or dismissed as part of the natural behavior of Turtle Mountain. The people of Frank, like many small mining towns, were focused on their daily lives, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Miners working deep inside the tunnels of the Canadian-American Coal and Coke Company had begun to notice unsettling changes. Coal seams that once required hard labor to extract were now breaking apart with little effort, as if the mountain itself was loosening its grip. Some workers even reported hearing deep rumbling sounds from within the earth, though no one could agree on their cause. To many, it was simply the groaning of the mountain, normal occurrence in a place where rock and coal had been mined for years. Outside the mine, strange occurrences were becoming more frequent. Over the winter, cracks had appeared along the eastern face of Turtle Mountain, widening as snowmelt and rainfall seeped into them. When temperatures dropped at night, the water froze, expanding within the fractures and further weakening the already unstable rock. The cycle repeated over and over, slowly but relentlessly pushing the mountain toward collapse. The indigenous peoples of the region, the Blackfoot and Kakatunaksa, had long warned that Turtle Mountain was unpredictable. Their oral histories spoke of a mountain that moves, a place that should be avoided. They had noticed the way the land shifted, the way the slopes never seemed to remain the same. But as settlers moved in and the mining industry expanded, these warnings were largely ignored. After all, coal mining was booming, and the town of Frank was growing quickly. People were focused on opportunity, not on what the mountain might do. In the days leading up to the disaster, the warnings became impossible to ignore. Small tremors rattled the town, shaking dishes on shelves and waking light sleepers in the middle of the night. On multiple occasions, sections of rock broke loose from the mountain's surface, tumbling down in minor landslides. Though unsettling, these events were not enough to stop daily operations. Life in Frank continued as usual, with miners reporting for work, trains running on schedule, and families going about their routines. Then, on the evening of April 28th, something even more disturbing happened. Workers inside the mine reported a sudden, powerful burst of coal gas, an explosive release of methane trapped within the rock. The force of the blast sent dust and debris flying through the tunnels, startling the miners. Many saw it as a bad omen, but with no real proof of danger. There was little they could do. Some men went home that night with an uneasy feeling, but others brushed it off as just another strange occurrence in a town built beneath an unpredictable mountain. As the town of Frank settled in for the night, no one could have known that within hours, Turtle Mountain would come crashing down, unleashing one of the deadliest landslides in Canadian history. In the early morning hours of April 29th, the residents of Frank were fast asleep, unaware that their town was about to be buried under a massive rockslide. Just before dawn, Turtle Mountain finally gave way. Without warning, a section of its eastern face collapsed, sending an avalanche of limestone boulders hurtling down at terrifying speed. The ground shook violently as millions of tons of rock broke free, crushing everything in their path. The slide moved with incredible force, covering over 2 miles in less than 2 minutes. Entire sections of the town were swallowed, homes and buildings vanishing beneath a sea of debris. The sound of the collapse was deafening. Those who survived described it as a thunderous roar that seemed to last forever. Some compared it to the sound of a massive explosion, while others recalled the deep, earth-shaking rumble that had woken them from sleep. Among the hardest hit areas was a row of houses located at the base of the mountain. Families were still inside, unaware of the danger until it was too late. Many were buried instantly as the rocks crashed down, their homes reduced to rubble in seconds. The slide also wiped out a portion of the Canadian-American Coal and Coke Company's mine entrance, trapping workers underground. Miraculously, some miners deep inside the tunnels managed to survive as the collapse sealed off their exit, but left an air pocket intact. The destruction extended beyond the town itself. A section of the railway that connected Frank to the rest of the region was completely buried, cutting off communication and transportation. A passing train had been scheduled to travel through the area that morning, but by sheer luck it had been running behind schedule, avoiding certain disaster. As the dust settled, the once thriving town of Frank was left in ruins. Survivors who had escaped the initial collapse were met with an eerie silence. What had once been homes, streets, and businesses was now an endless stretch of jagged rock. In the chaos, people began to search desperately for their loved ones, calling out names and digging through the rubble with their bare hands. The sheer scale of the devastation made rescue efforts difficult, and as the sun rose over the mountains, the full extent of the tragedy became clear. As the morning light revealed the devastation, the survivors of Frank struggled to make sense of what had happened. The once bustling mining town was now buried beneath an unrecognizable landscape of shattered limestone. Families searched desperately for missing loved ones, but with so much destruction, the chances of finding survivors grew slimmer by the hour. Many were trapped under tons of rock, and rescuers had little more than their hands and primitive tools to dig through the debris. News of the disaster spread quickly. By sunrise, word had reached nearby communities, and help was on the way. Early on April 30th, a special train from Fort Macleod arrived, carrying Northwest Mounted Police officers and doctors ready to assist with rescue and recovery efforts. The scene was overwhelming. Piles of boulders the size of houses covered what had once been homes and businesses. The force of the slide had been so immense that it had even pushed debris up the opposite side of the valley. Despite the destruction, there were stories of incredible survival. Some miners, trapped inside the tunnels when the entrance collapsed, managed to find their way out through secondary shafts, stumbling into the daylight, covered in dust but unharmed. One of the most astonishing discoveries was that of a horse named Charlie, who had been trapped underground for over a month. He survived by licking moisture from the tunnel walls and chewing on wooden support beams. When workers finally freed him, they celebrated by giving him a feast of oats and brandy. Unfortunately, the sudden intake of food was too much for the animal, and he died shortly after. Amid the relief efforts, geologists and engineers began to assess the stability of the mountain, fearing another collapse. Some believed that the Rockslide had been triggered by coal mining operations that had weakened Turtle Mountain's structure. Others pointed to the region's natural instability, noting that local indigenous groups had long referred to Turtle Mountain as the mountain that moves. Scientists sent by the Geological Survey of Canada inspected the mountain's peak and found new cracks forming, raising concerns about whether another rockslide could follow. Authorities debated whether to evacuate the remaining residents of Frank. Some officials insisted that it was too dangerous to stay, while others argued that the worst had already happened. In the end, the government allowed the town to remain, though certain areas were permanently abandoned. Years later, parts of the town would be relocated further from the mountain, as the threat of another slide could never be ruled out entirely. In the aftermath of the Frank slide, the town faced the difficult task of rebuilding. Though many families left, unwilling to risk another disaster, others chose to stay, determined to rebuild their lives in the shadow of Turtle Mountain. Over time, new structures were built, and the community adapted to the ever-present risk that loomed above them. The disaster also led to increased efforts to study and monitor the mountain. Scientists continued to investigate the causes of the slide, trying to determine whether human activity had played a role or if the collapse had been inevitable. The conclusion remained debated, but one thing was certain: Turtle Mountain was still shifting. Decades later, in the 20th century, monitoring systems were installed to track the mountain's movement, helping to predict any future rock slides before they could claim more lives. Though the town of Frank never fully recovered, the memory of the slide became an important part of Canadian history. The site of the disaster remains a haunting reminder of nature's power, with massive boulders still scattered across the valley unchanged since the moment they fell. Visitors from around the world come to see the landscape frozen in time, walking among the ruins of homes and businesses that were lost in the early hours of that tragic morning. The story of the Frank Slide is not just one of destruction, but of resilience. Those who survived carried on, their lives forever changed, but their determination unshaken. Today, the site serves as both a historical landmark and a cautionary tale, a place where the past and present exist side by side, reminding all who visit of the unstoppable forces that shape our world. It was a quiet Saturday morning on March 22, 2014. The small community of Oso, Washington, sat peacefully about 4 miles east of the main town center, tucked beside the North Fork of the Stillaguamish River. The neighborhood just south of the river, known as Steelhead Haven, was mostly made up of families and longtime residents who loved the peacefulness of living out there in the woods. The weather had been wet for weeks, nearly double. The usual rainfall had fallen over the previous month and a half, but nobody was too alarmed. Rain in western Washington wasn't anything new. At 10:37 that morning, everything changed. Without any warning, a huge chunk of the hillside just north of Steelhead Haven suddenly gave way. In seconds, a wave of mud, trees, and broken earth came roaring across the river like a wall of destruction. People who saw it later described it as sounding like a freight train. Others called it a tsunami made of dirt. The river didn't stand a chance. It was swallowed up. The mud barreled forward, slamming directly into the neighborhood. In just moments, 49 homes and structures were buried under the thick, wet earth. Everything in its path disappeared. The debris covered an area nearly 1 square mile wide. That's about the size of 700 football fields, just to picture it. And the mud didn't just sit on top, it dug in deep, as much as 70 feet in some spots. People miles away felt the ground shake. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network picked up the vibrations from the collapse almost instantly. Later on, scientists figured out the initial slide had lasted around 2.5 minutes, but there were aftershocks and smaller slides that continued for hours. Emergency responders were on the scene as fast as they could get there. Helicopters from the nearby Naval Air Station on Whidbey Island flew in, and local firefighters and medics from all over Snohomish County rushed to help, but the situation was already devastating. What they found was a complete disaster zone. In those first few hours, 8 people were pulled from the debris alive. That gave families hope. But as the day turned to night, it became clear that many people had not made it out in time. 43 lives were eventually lost, making this the deadliest single landslide in American history, not caused by an earthquake, volcanic eruption, or dam collapse. By that night, the state's Lieutenant Governor Brad Owen had declared a state of emergency. The next day, Governor Jay Inslee flew over the site in a helicopter to see the damage himself. What he saw from the sky was unimaginable. What had once been a quiet rural neighborhood now looked like the aftermath of a natural bomb going off, just a sea of broken trees, twisted houses, and endless mud. And this was only the beginning. After the deadly landslide hit Oso on the morning of March 22nd, 2014, the scene left behind was nearly impossible to believe. Trees were ripped from the ground like weeds. Homes had been picked up and tossed or buried under thick, heavy layers of mud and debris. It wasn't just a collapse, it looked like the land itself had exploded. What once had been a peaceful riverside neighborhood, known as Steelhead Haven, was now an unrecognizable field of destruction stretching over 1 square mile. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, even though access was incredibly difficult. The massive flow of mud had completely blocked off State Route 530, the main road in and out of the area. This made it nearly impossible for emergency crews to get to the site quickly. Some responders had to arrive by helicopter, others took back roads through the mountains, some of which were still covered in snow. Despite the danger, more than 100 first responders showed up that day from all around Snohomish County and neighboring counties. Firefighters, police, paramedics, and volunteers all joined forces. Even the Navy's search and rescue team from Whidbey Island got involved. They all worked together, digging through the muck with whatever they had, from heavy equipment to their bare hands. As they worked, everyone was holding out hope for survivors. On that first day, 8 people were rescued from the debris and rushed to nearby hospitals. Some had been trapped in what was left of their homes. Others were found clinging to pieces of wood barely above the mud line. Every minute counted and the clock was ticking fast. But even as help poured in, the weather remained a major challenge. The ground was still soaked from weeks of rain leading up to the slide. It made the mud deep, sticky, and unstable. Equipment would get stuck, roads kept washing out, and the river itself, the North Fork of the Stillaguamish, had been completely blocked by the slide, creating a massive backup of water. Officials worried that if the natural dam gave way, it could cause even more damage downstream. A flash flood watch was issued just in case. Meanwhile, the community of Oso and nearby Darrington, a small mountain town about 16 miles east, were essentially cut off. Supplies had to be airlifted in, and families desperately waited for any word about their missing loved ones. The scope of the disaster became clearer by the hour. Entire families were unaccounted for. Some homes had vanished without a trace. As night fell on March 22nd, the Lieutenant Governor of Washington declared a state of emergency. The next day, Governor Jay Inslee flew over the scene. What he saw from the air was heartbreaking. A vast brown wasteland where a tight-knit neighborhood used to stand. And still, the rescuers worked. Mud-caked and exhausted, they searched on, refusing to give up hope. Behind them, the mountains stood silent, as if holding their breath. The search would only grow larger in the coming days, and the heartbreak deeper. In the days following the Oso Landslide, search and recovery efforts became a grueling, round-the-clock mission. Crews were no longer hoping for a miracle. They were now searching for the missing and trying to bring closure to grieving families. The wall of mud had buried everything under layers that reached up to 75 feet in some spots. The scale was staggering and the conditions remained brutal. As more federal resources arrived, including teams from FEMA and the National Guard, The operation grew in both size and complexity. Hundreds of workers took part in a carefully coordinated effort. Cadaver dogs were brought in to locate human remains. GPS mapping tools helped chart out the disaster zone in small sections. Every day, workers braved thick, unstable ground that could shift without warning. Heavy machinery slowly cleared debris, but many areas could only be reached by foot. Volunteers waded through cold, muddy water, searching for signs of life or loss. The river, still blocked by the natural dam, was rising slowly behind the slide, creating fears of a secondary flood. Engineers worked urgently to carve a new channel and relieve pressure on the fragile barrier. Meanwhile, the community pulled together in powerful ways. Churches opened their doors to families in need. Local restaurants cooked meals for rescue teams. Donations poured in from across the state and beyond. Blankets, supplies, and financial help for displaced residents. The town of Arlington, located west of the slide, became a staging point where families waited anxiously for news. Identification of the victims proved difficult. Many bodies were found far from where their homes had stood, carried by the force of the debris. Personal items, toys, clothing, photo albums, were retrieved and set aside, each one a clue to someone's life. Medical examiners worked carefully to identify remains and provide answers to families who had been left in limbo. By the end of the first week, more than 30 people were confirmed dead. Dozens were still missing. Memorials began to appear on the roadside. Wooden crosses, flowers, and handwritten notes to the lost. Each name that was recovered brought both sorrow and a measure of peace to those waiting. There was also growing scrutiny over how such a tragedy could happen. Questions emerged about whether the area had been safe to build on in the first place. The hillside that collapsed had a long history of instability. Past slides had occurred in the same location, including one large event in the year 2006, but a few people seem to have known the full risk, and now those decisions were under the microscope. Still, the focus remained on the people. The victims, the survivors, and the hundreds of workers doing the hard and heartbreaking job of recovery. Every shovel of mud, every item found, every name spoken aloud, it all mattered deeply, and this was no longer just a rescue effort. It had become a solemn promise to honor those who were lost and stand by the families left behind. In the weeks that followed the Oso Landslide, Washington state and federal officials began a deeper investigation into what had gone wrong. The shock of the disaster gave way to tough questions about land use, environmental oversight, and public safety. Geologists and engineers were among the first to study the collapsed site in detail. They discovered that the slide had started high on a hillside known to have moved before. Layers of loose, water-saturated soil had given way all at once. What had made this event different was its speed and violence. The slope did not slump gradually, it exploded outward in a single catastrophic motion. Experts found that rainfall had played a major role. March had been one of the wettest months on record in the region. The saturated ground became unstable, and the Stillaguamish River at the base of the hill had been slowly eroding the slope for years. When the collapse came on March 22nd, everything gave way in seconds, but the science led to harder truths. Public records showed that the area had experienced multiple landslides in the past. Some maps dated back to the 1940s and showed danger zones marked clearly. A particularly large slide in the year 2006 had left behind warning signs. Despite this, homes had been rebuilt and new permits had been issued. Residents later said they had not been warned about the full extent of the risk. Some knew there had been previous slides, but few understood just how unstable the ground truly was. That lack of communication became a central concern. State and local agencies had data, but it had not always been shared clearly or acted upon quickly enough. The tragedy also exposed weaknesses in building policies. There were no federal laws that prevented people from constructing homes in known landslide zones. Local regulations varied from county to county, and in rural areas like Oso, oversight was limited. The disaster showed how vulnerable communities could be when information and regulation failed to align. Public hearings were soon held. Survivors, scientists, and lawmakers spoke about what needed to change. There was a growing sense that better mapping, clearer warnings, and stricter construction rules were all essential to preventing another event like this one. Meanwhile, environmental specialists studied the long-term effects of the slide. The Stillaguamish River had been rerouted by the debris, affecting fish habitats and downstream water quality. Replanting efforts began in damaged forest areas, But recovery would take years. The land, like the people, had been deeply scarred. As spring turned to summer, the investigation continued, and the focus gradually shifted from recovery to resilience. Washington State began reviewing land use policies. Experts pushed for stronger protections and better public awareness campaigns. The lessons from Oso were hard-earned, but they could not be ignored. Behind every technical report and policy change were the lives of the 43 people who had died. Each decision going forward carried the weight of their memory. The question was no longer what had happened. It was how to make sure it never happened again. Years after the Oso landslide, the community and state have worked to rebuild not just the physical landscape, but also the sense of safety and hope for the future. Memorials were established to honor the 43 lives lost, serving as reminders of the tragedy and the resilience of those left behind. In the aftermath, Washington lawmakers passed new regulations aimed at reducing risk in vulnerable areas. These policies required more comprehensive geological surveys before construction permits could be granted. Additionally, counties were mandated to improve emergency preparedness, including better evacuation plans for landslide-prone zones. Technology also played a growing role. Remote sensing tools such as LiDAR and satellite imaging became essential in monitoring hillside movement. These advancements helped experts identify early warning signs that might have gone unnoticed before. Public agencies began issuing alerts when unstable ground was detected, giving residents precious time to evacuate. Local schools and community centers incorporated landslide education into their programs. Teaching residents about natural hazards became a priority, fostering a culture of awareness. Drills were held regularly so families would know how to respond if a disaster struck again. Economically, the region faced challenges. The destruction of homes and infrastructure caused significant setbacks. However, investments in rebuilding efforts created new jobs and encouraged community revitalization. Infrastructure improvements, including stronger bridges and better drainage systems, helped protect against future floods and slides. Researchers continued to study Oso as a case example of landslide dynamics in a disaster response. Scientific papers published around the world reference the event, contributing to global understanding of how such disasters unfold. The lessons learned have influenced safety practices far beyond Washington's borders. Despite progress, the memory of the landslide remains vivid. Survivors and families of victims carry their grief quietly but firmly. Community support groups formed, providing a space to share stories and heal together. Oso's story stands as a powerful warning. It shows how nature's forces can change lives in an instant, and how preparation, respect for science, and strong community ties are essential to facing the unknown. The legacy of the March 22, 2014 landslide is one of tragedy and hope. It is a call to action, to listen to the land, to act with urgency, and to remember those who can no longer speak for themselves. Through these efforts, Oso continues forward, determined to build a safer tomorrow.